Hey, Wellness Warriors, welcome to the Wellness Revolution podcast, where we're simplifying health and amplifying life. I'm Dr. Milan Riobe, board certified medical doctor, burnout recovery specialist, and your guide on your journey to becoming the healthiest version of you, mind, body, and spirit. Today, we're going to crack open a truth that might shake up everything you've ever believed about mental health. What if I told you that mental health isn't mental? What if I told you that mental really actually means physical because your brain is part of your body? What if anxiety, depression, brain fog, irritability, mood swings, and burnout itself, things we've always attributed to the mental aspect of our well-being, weren't actually signs of a mental disorder, but actually signs of a burnt out metabolism? The idea that things are mental comes from an artificial division that we kind of created, where we put the brain kind of on a different pedestal or different category from the rest of our body. And I'm going to show you today why that's a false premise and, in fact, is hindering our ability to properly treat what we're labeling as mental health disorders. So, buckle up. This episode is for anyone who's ever been told it's all in your head, but deep down, you knew that it was something deeper. You knew that it wasn't just because you're the mother of two kids or you have a demanding career or job. You knew that it wasn't just because you're getting so-called older or that, stress just does these things to people. So while our focus on mental health disorders has increased over the last several years, our success rates of treating them has not. Mental health conditions are not only on the rise, but the solutions are getting harder and harder to grasp. People are feeling like they're just not getting the help that they need. Why is that? If we look at what we're blaming for mental health disorders, for example, the lack of serotonin, the lack of dopamine, the lack of oxytocin, for example, or the increased amounts of chronic stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, we start to see like, wait, these things are not mental things. They're actually physical structures, right? They're neurotransmitters. They're types of proteins. They are hormones. Those are proteins, right? These are physical things that flow in the body, allegedly quite seamlessly. However, in the face of a mental health disorder, there are issues, there are problems, right? These problems are not mental, right? They are not isolated to the brain. They are an entire body issue because your brain is part of your body. So the fundamental flaw and the reason we're not getting anywhere in treating mental health disorders is because we're not realizing that the brain isn't some separate entity that's out there somewhere, that we have to fix by itself, isolated on an island, but is in fact a seamless part that's supposed to flow with the rest of our bodies. And so we're realizing that it's very, very difficult to just treat the brain, right? When we take antidepressants, anxiety medications, while those things may be excellent temporary band-aids to help us from, completely decompensating under the many, many, numerous traumas and reasons why people are having mental health issues, they don't really actually fix the root of the issue. And so this is why many people, after they've been on these medications for some time, feel that the treatments are incomplete because they actually are. So when we think of the neurotransmitters and the hormones that are supposed to be in balance to give us our mental health, right? To give us our good mood, our joy, our peace of mind, right? These things are physical structures. These things are things that are made out of the food that we eat, made out of the oxygen that we breathe, and they are transformed within each and every one of our cells, not just the brain cells, but everywhere in our bodies to create this seamless flow that results in joy, that results in peace of mind, in having really great, stable energy. and vitality. And so this is a huge missing piece when we talk about mental health disorders. So the talk therapy, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy is really very important. Sometimes medications are also very important to bridge people. But unless we look at what actually is creating the situation within the body from the trauma, right? So we understand that mental health issues originate from traumas, experiences that we have as we're moving through life, stressful events that we experience as we're moving through life that often start in the womb, right? Even before we're born. There are toxins coming in, to our little developing bodies as we're sitting in our mother's wombs. That's a trauma, right? That creates a stress that we have to endure before we're ever out in the world. Then we come out in the world, right? And all the noise and all of the conversations going on around us, all of the experience that we have, all of that is being registered and registered and registered. And the brain is the system that captures that information, but that's not where it ends, right? So what happens then is the brain sends all of the signals down in response to those events, in response to those experiences, whether it's categorizing them as stressful or not stressful, right? And if it's categorizing the experiences as stressful, for example, even a young child, if they're hearing a lot of yelling and screaming in their environments, right, or they're exposed, for example, to traumatic things on a television screen, then these things come in and they're processed by the brain. But that's not where it ends. The brain then sends signals down as it's translating that data and interpreting that data as either a threat or not a threat, right? And the chemicals that it sends down are different when it perceives a threat versus not a threat. And so this is where the neurotransmitters are really important. This is where the hormones are really important because your brain has to send those physical things down into the body for the body to respond, right? There's never a time in anyone's life where the data just stays in the brain and it doesn't go anywhere, right? It has to be translated and sent down as a nervous system input into the body because, again, you can't separate your brain from your body. So while mental health appears to be something that has to deal with traumas and emotions, it's actually cellular. Those things always get translated down to the level of our cells, whether it's the brain cells that are processing the data and determining whether it's a threat or not a threat, or the cells that are receiving the signal downstream of the brain once it's determined if it's a threat or not a threat. And what your cells of your body do in response to that is where the magic is. This is where mental health disorders can be successfully treated. And again, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be, taking prescribed medications if necessary. I'm not suggesting that we should not have, talk therapy. Those things are really, really important, but they're not the complete treatment. So we really want to fix something at its root. We have to look at all of the important components that are involved and treat them all, not just one or two and then hope the third and fourth ones come along for the ride, because that almost never happens, right? It's as though when I teach people about the 4 pillars of wellness, you got to get all 4 up and running. You can't just go for 1 or 2 and hope pillar number 3 and 4 just come along for the ride. That doesn't happen, right? You have to have them all in place. The same thing happens in the body. We have to really look at all of the components. So mental health is emotional, so again, there's a trauma that comes in that triggers an emotion, that triggers the brain to interpret, am I under threat or am I not under threat? And then it behaves accordingly. If it feels itself to not be under threat, it's going to send all the happy neurotransmitters, the happy hormones down into the body. That's where the serotonin, the dopamine, the oxytocin go up, and gets sent and transmitted all through the body. And the body responds, right? This is why we can feel the emotion of joy and excitement. This is also why we can viscerally feel sadness and fear and anger, right? Because those emotions don't stay in the brain. They get transmitted down into the body. And the body has a visceral cellular, response as a whole being. So if all we're doing is, for example, looking at the traumas, revisiting the traumas and trying to release the traumas, but the end results of the traumas within the physical body have not been addressed, then there's going to be this mismatch. And it's going to be much harder to let go of those traumas if the physiological responses and the changes that occurred on a cellular level are not also addressed and resolved, right? So when you get the physical stuff also resolved, in addition to the emotional stuff and the traumatic stuff resolved, now you have a whole and complete treatment. And this is what's missing today in our mainstream model when we look at mental health. And the metabolic disturbances that are going on deep in the body cells, which are the cause of the perpetuation of the mental health issues, are also what cause side effects from the medications. And so very often people that take antidepressants will report weight gain, they'll report low libido, which is a loss of interest in sex. They will report feeling also sometimes emotionally blunted, like they can't really feel their emotions. And often this is because the medication is working on a very narrow scope of body functions, right? By preventing the reabsorption of serotonin and also adjusting levels of norepinephrine in some cases. And so, because it's a narrow scope of function of the medication, it doesn't take the entirety of metabolism into consideration. And so, there are gaps that are there that the antidepressants don't fill. And so this is the cause of many antidepressant side effects as well. This is also a reason why people report that they may not work as well. And it could also be a cause of the difficulty in getting off of the antidepressants once someone has been on them for a while. So people will often note that they have what they identify as withdrawal symptoms when they are feeling better and under the care of a psychiatrist are starting to wean off of their antidepressants. They report nausea, headaches, not feeling well, rebound anxiety, and other factors. And so again, this is simply because that underlying the mood disorder itself is metabolic disturbance. And it's those metabolic disturbances that were sometimes worsened by the medication because again, medications drive a very specific function and they don't look at the entirety of the root cause. And so sometimes antidepressants are kind of doing two wrongs to equal a right, where they're elevating the serotonin levels so that someone's mood doesn't drop, but that's coming at the expense of other metabolic functions. And so this is what creates the side effects. This is what creates the difficulty even of getting off of the antidepressants. And so in order to successfully resolve that, you have to look at what is going on in the metabolism deep in the cells of the entire body, not just the brain, right? And again, Chinese medicine teaches us this lesson so well. They really have such a holistic viewpoint of well-being because I guess maybe because they got a 4,000-year head start, but also the premise of their system of medicine is so grounded and so holistic that they have a much wider lens than we do. Unfortunately, in our mainstream model, we tend to be very narrow. We're looking for, the specific, reaction that's creating the symptom, and then we want to block it with a medication. The reaction that's creating the symptom is usually the tip of the iceberg of thousands of other reactions that are leading to it. And so, those reactions are off balance as well. Chinese medicine goes further back and looks at those things much more comprehensively, so it gives a much bigger picture of why that person is feeling the way they're feeling, why they're having the mood swings and the emotional lability or irritability that they report, or the depression, the anxiety, the mind racing, the brain fog. And so Chinese medicine teaches us a very important lesson about the brain. And it tells us that there's a difference between mind and brain. And this is not something we discuss in our mainstream model, like we throw them together like they're the same thing, right? So people will interchangeably talk about mind and brain, whereas in Chinese medicine, they completely separate them and they distinguish between the two. So if you ask a Chinese medicine practitioner, or if you look in a Chinese medicine textbook and you look up mind, you will be told by the textbook or the person that mind is housed in the heart and that it is an energy field and not a physical structure. So if you ask a Chinese medicine practitioner, where is mind? They will say it's everywhere because it's not bound by the body. And so they will not say brain is everywhere. They will say mind is everywhere. And so they very distinctly distinguish, and they go to great lengths to distinguish that they are not the same, right? And this is important because when we talk about emotions, when we talk about traumas that we experience, whether they be physical or emotional or mental or any of the various ways that we categorize our trauma, we are talking about things that happen in the mind, things that first influence the mind, which then influences the brain. And so the mind is out there, it's not in here. And so when we're experiencing something with the outside world, mind is interacting out there. And that is resulting in what is translated by the brain, how the brain perceives what is happening. And then that gets translated into the body as the physical, nervous system responses that the brain initiates. So the Institute of Heart Math discovered an electromagnetic field that emanates from the human heart. This was discovered initially in the 1990s in Canada, actually. And the discovery was that there were groups of cells in the human heart that were not identifiable as what we would traditionally call heart cells. And so they looked more like brain cells. And so they coined the term heart brain at the time, and they began to study these cells. What they realized about these cells is that they actually sent more nerves from the heart to the brain than the brain sent back to the heart. And so this was really disturbing to our Western thinking because we have been taught that the brain commands the body. The brain is like command central. Everything begins and ends in the brain. And that everything that happens in the body is a result of everything that happens in the brain. And so this discovery of what they called heart brain threw that all up in the air and called that all into question. Because how could the heart be sending 40 times the number of nerves to the brain than the brain is sending back to the heart? That didn't make any sense, right? Because the brain was supposed to be the commander of the heart. But in Chinese medicine, they teach us very early on in our studies that the heart is actually the commander of the body. And for me as a medical doctor, like I had already been, trained as a medical doctor, indoctrinated in all our belief systems. Now I'm sitting in the Chinese medicine course and I'm listening to this idea that the heart is the commander of the body. And, I had a visceral response. I'm like, wait, what? That can't be. Like the brain is the commander of the body, not the heart, right? But that was a premise that they taught very early on. The heart is the commander. And they didn't even talk about the brain, which was interesting. The brain came later, but it wasn't like one of their five, organs that they talk about. And again, in Chinese medicine, when they talk about organs, they're not talking about physical structures. They're talking about energy fields. And so again, the language is not 100% translatable. Now they talk about the energy field called kidney, and the brain is part of that field. The brain itself is not a major organ system in Chinese medicine theory. And so they kind of relegated it off to the side a bit, and didn't talk about it very much, which was again very odd to me. And I had to literally dump everything out of my head that I had ever learned about medicine to begin to understand Chinese medicine. And so finally it started to sink in because as they, of course, as they kept teaching and I kept reading textbooks and learning and practicing, I began to understand like what they were talking about. Like, oh yeah, heart is the commander of the body because of mind. And mind is housed in the heart. So we would consider mind to be something like consciousness. That's another way of looking at it. That would be something that's more accepted scientific term now. So we're beginning to understand through science that yes, there is this thing called consciousness. And they haven't quite linked it to the heart electromagnetic field yet, but it's pretty close. So it's just a matter of time, right? It took science 4,000 years to scientifically show that heart is the commander of the body, right? That happened in the 1990s. The Chinese knew about that thousands of years ago. So it takes us a while to catch up, with our science to what they somehow managed to know thousands of years ago. They're almost never wrong. Like, in fact, I can't even think of a premise where Chinese medicine theory has been wrong. In all the years that I've practiced it as a Chinese medicine, practitioner as well as a medical doctor, whenever they don't agree with each other, it's usually been allopathic medicine that's been wrong and not Chinese medicine. And in fact, we see when we do studies in allopathic medicine that we tend to overturn our own studies within a matter of sometimes as short as 3 years. And again, that's because medicine is a practice, right? We're still a young science if you really look at it. Like there are, systems of medicine that are thousands of years old. We're just a couple hundred years old, right? So we're like the new kids on the block. We're fumbling around trying to figure things out. If we were to look at the premises that are taught in ancient philosophies and kind of use them as a bit of a guidepost to do our studies, we would probably move along a lot faster. So now we consider the idea of heart rate variability to actually be very important for well-being. And it's being accepted as a vital sign at this point. Just like blood pressure, just like your heart rate variability actually really matters. And that's a physical electrical thing that happens in the conduction system of the human heart. How variable your heartbeat is really actually quite important. So in terms of heart rate variability, so imagine if you put yourself on a heart monitor and you were just to look at your heart rate. What you should see is from one beat to the next beat, there should be a huge jump in your heart rate. So in other words, your heartbeat should go, for example, from 60 to 80 in one beat, and then come back down to like 62, for example, and jump up to 84, come back down to like 66, and it should just bounce around like that and have variability of up to 20 beats per minute per beat. So what that means is from the time your heart beats once to the next beat, if you calculate what the heart rate is between those two beats, it should be 20 beats or so. If you're frustrated, if you're stressed, your heart rate variability actually shrinks. So it gets very narrow. So similarly, if you were to put yourself on a heart monitor and look at your heart rate, it would only vary by a few beats. So it would go maybe from like 72 to 76, back down to 70, up to 74. It would stay very narrow. So from one beat to the next beat, it would only change by 4 beats per minute. And so what we're discovering is the physical structure and how it beats has a lot to do with our actual health. Why? It's actually what controls the brain and allows it to send the responses down into the body. So the Institute of Heart Math also was instrumental in discovering an electromagnetic field that's actually emanated from the human heart. So again, it is not bound to the inside of the body. It's something that goes out 8 to 11 feet or more from the body. So an electromagnetic field is something that is made by an electrical circuit. So anywhere where there's electricity, you're going to have an electromagnetic field emanate from that. The human brain has an electromagnetic field. The human heart has an electromagnetic field. And what they discovered is that the electromagnetic field of the human heart is actually 100 times more powerful than the electromagnetic field emanated by the human brain, which again was just ridiculous, right? That's not supposed to be. We have all these neurons in here. way more neurons in the brain than in the heart. And yet, the one propagated by the heart is 100 times stronger than the one propagated by the brain, right? So that was mind blowing too. But it's been duplicated in studies, right? So there's validity to what they're saying. It's not just a one off. So there's an electromagnetic field in the heart that is dominant, over the body. And so again, this is very reminiscent of what in Chinese medicine they say the heart is the commander of the body. And so heart rate variability varies, obviously. That's why it's called variability, right? And that's why it can go up and down and change. And it is a sign of the adaptability and flexibility of the heart rhythm. And why that's important is they also discovered that it's controlled by the breath. So we used to think that the brain controlled the breath. And to some extent it does, right? So if we hold our breath, at some point the brain will override us and force us to breathe, right? So some people can hold their breath for, like David Blaine can hold his breath for I think 12 minutes or something like that, right? And then others of us can only hold our breath for a minute or so. Eventually the brain overrides us. The brain is like, no, 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 you're going to kill yourself. You need to breathe, right? And so it forces us to take a breath. But on a breath by breath basis, as we're actually just breathing normally throughout the day, it's actually our breath that controls our brain because it controls the heart rate variability. And what they've discovered about heart rate variability is that it determines what the brain sends down into the body. So low heart rate variability, or what they call in heart math non-coherence or low coherence. This is when the heart rate variability is narrow, is correlates with stress. When someone is frustrated, and you don't even have to be aware that you're stressed. A lot of our stress is in the background. It's subconscious. We're not thinking about it. And it's there harassing the brain, and the brain is sending down stress signals, right? And then it creates this vicious loop with our breathing because then we tend to start shallow breathing and we don't breathe fully, and that leads to this feedback of continuing this low heart rate variability. So you get this vicious circle in the body where you're shallow breathing, and that's sending the signal to the brain to keep sending stress responses into the body, which is then again creating these physiological metabolic changes throughout all the cells of your body to erode them, to wear them out, to create this metabolic instability that we will then identify as a mental health issue, right? So it's not that stress itself causes a mental health issue if we can rebound from the stress, right? It's when the stress is kind of continuing in the background and it's constantly changing and signaling the body's metabolism, either wearing it out or creating inflammation and toxicity in the metabolism. Either way, it's causing disruption of metabolism. It's when the metabolism itself becomes disrupted that now we develop what we will identify as a mental health disorder, whether it's anxiety, depression, are related to also metabolism and the destruction of metabolism through the constant signaling. And so it's this breathing constantly sending signals to the brain and reinforcing the stress that creates this low heart rate variability. They're all intertwined, right? So it's kind of a chicken and egg game, but they feed on each other, and that's what causes the breakdown of metabolism. And so that's all physical, that's all physiological, that's all metabolic. So how we breathe literally changes our brain. It literally changes how our heart electromagnetic field and the heart rate variability sends signals to the brain that then either result in the body being stressed or the body relaxing and recovering. And it can't do both. So it's one or the other. Like you can't be in stress and relaxation at the same time. Like it's not possible. That's like thinking you can flip a coin and have it land on both sides at the same time. Can't do it, right? So it's the same in the body. So how we breathe is hugely important to how we feel. and how much damage is done in the body that then results in that mental health disorder. So when we want to reverse engineer that and recover, one of the most important things we need to do on a physical level is learn to properly breathe. And so they've developed a technique for that they call the quick coherence technique. And they've done studies on it related to anxiety and depression and um, insomnia and weight gain even, and many other things that you can read about on their website. But the end result is the reason it's so powerful is because it feeds that heart rate variability, and it allows the heart rate variability to be healthy, to be adaptable, to be high, to be in high coherence. When your body's in high coherence, that means that you're much more flexible, adaptable. The body is free to recover, to restore itself, to rest, to build its metabolism back up, to fix the damage. That's what heart rate variability means, like when it's normal, when it's high. When it's narrow, your body perceives itself to be under threat. There's no time to restore. There's no time to recover. There's no time to deal with mental health disorders. We just need to flee, right? And again, you may not even be moving, right? You may be sitting at your desk working, but that's the conversation that's going on subconsciously. Your body thinks it's under threat if you feel stress. And so this is one of the most important tools is breath work to get out of this loop of a mental health disorder. Now, again, you want to make sure that you're properly evaluated, properly diagnosed. If you need to take medications, whether it's temporary, whether it's long-term, make sure that you do so. If you need to have therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or other types of therapies, make sure that you do that as well. And also, looking at the physiological aspects, while those things are bridging you, while those things are giving you the stability that you need to move forward, you then also look at what's going on with my metabolism and what are the things I can start to do now to help relieve the distress that's going on a metabolic level in my body that is the actual cause of this mental health issue. And so again, trauma, the reason it causes a mental health issue is the metabolic changes that it creates in the body. If it didn't create those metabolic changes and that damage in the body, it would be much easier to release the trauma. And so again, when things are deeply buried in the body on a cellular level, we have to get those cells to function better so that we can kind of get out of the metabolic scenario that is leading to the mental health issue. So breath work, that's number one. So the technique that's been studied and shown to be very useful as an adjunct is the 3-minute quick coherence technique. You've heard me talk about this many times on the podcast, but it's just that important. It bears repeating over and over again, just like it bears breathing properly over and over again. So it's 5 seconds in, very slowly, only through the nostrils, never through the mouth. And you don't hold your breath doing this technique. You don't even want to hear air moving through your nostrils. So it's super slow, 5 seconds in, and then 5 seconds out, and then repeat. And you do that for 3 minutes. Now, the secret sauce is, yes, doing it for 3 minutes, but doing it 3 times a day. That's the magic. When you do it 3 times a day, what happens is you build this momentum, and the impact of the breath work lasts and lingers for up to 6 hours. And so, again, nature didn't build us to have to hyper focus on our breath all day long, because if we did that, we would be attacked by the bear, right? We wouldn't even be here having this conversation because we wouldn't have made it past infancy as a human race, right? We would have not had the appropriate stress responses if we had to sit and focus on our breath all day long. So this is why it makes sense that it's just 3 minutes, 3 times a day, right? Now, you don't need to do it longer than 3 minutes, but the consistency of doing it 3 times a day is really important because that's what creates the momentum that leads to the lasting results. Same thing as kind of going to the gym, or like you can't just do it once and forget about it, right? You have to continuously work on your body in the gym so that you don't lose your muscle mass, right? If you don't go to the gym for 2 months, guess what? Your muscles are just going to fall apart. You have to start over. It's the same thing with your lungs. It's the same thing with the breath work. It's the same thing with the brain, right? if we don't consistently do the breath work, the brain loses the gains that it's made, right? So it's like anything else. Like if we don't stay in shape, we go out of shape, right? If we don't practice something, we forget how to do it, right? It's not like riding a bike, it's different. And so this breath work is really key. And it's really the number one thing that I teach all of my clients, whether it's my online clients for our burnout resolution programs or private clients. I spend a lot of time on this because if you don't breathe properly, your body really can't do the other things that you need it to do, which is properly assimilate your nutrients, to mix it with the oxygen, right? When you don't breathe right, it's not that you're going to pass out and become hypoxic. This is something that happens deep in your cells, right? So if we're taking shallow breaths and we're not breathing properly, there are pockets of cells in our bodies that won't get enough oxygen. It's not going to be this global thing where we're going to get dizzy and pass out and turn blue and all of that. This is inside your cells on a deeper level. So there will be some cells, not all of them will be deprived of oxygen because your body knows it has to get oxygen to certain really important places, but not hair follicles, for example, not skin cells very much, not much the bones, not much the musculoskeletal system, right? So if you're shallow breathing, there are cells in low priority areas that aren't getting 100% of their oxygen supplies, right? And so oxygen is really important in the body because it dictates how your metabolism runs. So your metabolism is much, 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 much more powerful and much stronger when there's oxygen present in the cell than when there isn't oxygen present in the cell. Now, again, it's not that your cell is not going to get any oxygen. It's going to get some. It's just not going to get as much as it needs if you're not breathing properly. So it'll be going on, 50% capacity. It just can't go on 100%. But that might be enough to start losing hair, right? That might be enough to have dry skin, acne, dermatitis, right? Eczema. It might be enough to be losing muscle mass, to have osteoporosis, right? And eventually that might be enough to create an Alzheimer's dementia type of scenario and other conditions, right? Your brain, your body doesn't need your entire brain to function, right? It just needs the part of your brain that runs your heart and your breathing. So the rest of your brain is not a priority as much as the centers of your brain that control heartbeat and your lungs. And so there are parts, cracks and crevices in the human brain if we're shallow breathing all the time that don't get enough oxygen. So this can be a contributing factor to mental health disorders, brain fog, lack of memory. And so it's not a big stretch to see that if this goes on for too long and my cells are being deprived of oxygen, I can potentially develop a memory condition. I can potentially develop Alzheimer's dementia or even a brain tumor, right? Tumors love lack of oxygen. They thrive in places, pockets in the body that aren't getting enough oxygen. Why is oxygen so important, right? We know it's important, but we don't often know why it's important. So yes, we need oxygen obviously to power the human body. And if we don't get oxygen, then we would die, right? But the reason for that is on a metabolic level. So inside of the cell's mitochondria, where energy is actually made, that's where oxygen performs all of its magic tricks. So the magic that happens in the mitochondria with oxygen is that when we take a gram of sugar, so sugar is the main, food substance that the body converts into energy. So it takes sugar and it converts it into usable currency called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It then takes that currency, so it's like money, it's making money out of the sugar. So it takes the money and then it goes to the marketplace and then it powers its functions. So if it's an eye cell, it will take that ATP and it will power vision with it. So first it has to get the sugar in the cell, combine it with oxygen to make that energy. So your cells don't have to use oxygen to make energy. So your body has a backup mechanism just in case you're not getting enough oxygen. So just in case, yes, I'm running away from a predator and I don't have time to breathe right now, so deal with it, right? So your body has an ability to not use oxygen for short periods of time to get its business done, such as fleeing from a tiger or some, bona fide threat. But the problem is if we continue to shallow breathe, and again, subconsciously, because of chronic stress, your body continues to feel itself to be under threat, it will cause this shallow breathing that then will lead to some of those cells, for example, again, hair follicles, skin, bones, muscles, liver cells, right? Liver cells are not as important as heart cells. And so if you're really shallow breathing and you're not getting enough sleep and you're not eating right, and your liver cells may not have enough oxygen to function properly, right? Again, that doesn't mean all your liver cells aren't getting oxygen, but there will be pockets in your liver cells not getting their full complement of oxygen. Now, again, there's a backup system for that, but the backup system is like nothing compared to plan A, right? Plan B is really like a shell of plan A. So plan A is I'm breathing properly, I'm getting all my oxygen. Now, oxygen is getting into the mitochondria. When your mitochondria takes that oxygen, mixes it with that sugar, it makes, if for a gram of sugar, it makes 36 units of ATP. So $36 it gets to print when there's oxygen present. So now if that cell is not getting enough oxygen, there's a backup system, but the mitochondria would not be involved in the backup system. So now the backup system is I have to make energy outside of the mitochondria in what we call the cytoplasm of the cell. And that's bad news. So for every gram of sugar that in the mitochondria, you got to make 36 units of ATP. Outside the mitochondria, in the cytoplasm, that same gram of sugar only gives you 2 units of ATP. So it's not even just a little bit less, it's astoundingly less energy. And so it's really important to properly breathe because you want as much energy being made in your mitochondria as possible with oxygen. The other bad news about not making energy in the mitochondria is the end products of making that ATP in the mitochondria, you're making water and carbon dioxide. Outside of the mitochondria, when there's not enough oxygen, you're making lactic acid and alcohol, right? So both of those things are very dehydrating, right? So you're not recycling your water because it's not happening in the mitochondria, and you're dehydrating yourself and you're making yourself more acidic, right? Simply because we're not breathing properly. So it's really important to do proper breathing. And again, you don't have to do this all day. Like you get this lingering impact when you do it 3 times a day, which is what's amazing. If you don't have enough energy, right? If your mitochondria don't get to work 100%, then you're not going to have enough energy to power all of your body function. This is where that slippery slope comes in that takes you down the path of burnout, also mental health conditions, or any number of other chronic diseases based on, genetic predispositions at that point. So if you have a genetic predisposition to cancer, for example, then you may be headed down the slippery slope of a cancer diagnosis. If you have a genetic predisposition to mental health disorders, then you may be heading down that slippery slope. Or any number of other chronic diseases. If you have a genetic predisposition to diabetes, then, again, not making enough energy in the cells leads you down the slippery slope towards diabetes due to the genetic predispositions, right? And so this is where the genes matter. But we get to control that if we breathe properly. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what the science is telling us, right? We understand mitochondrial science and how important it is in our well-being. And again, it all starts with what is my brain perceiving based on my breath? So your breath is literally like a memo that you're sending to the brain. So you're flipping a coin literally, and that coin's going to land on heads or tails. And it matters how the coin lands because that dictates what your brain does. And that dictates whether or not the insides of your cells can function properly and whether they're going to become metabolically damaged or stay metabolically healthy. And that's the difference between a mental health disorder and well-being. And so this is why mental health is not mental. It is actually physiological. Now that, again, that doesn't mean that the traumas didn't come in through an emotional input, right? Or even a physical input, like God forbid, those who have been physically abused, they come in through different channels and avenues, but it's the resulting damage to the inside of the body that determines if that trauma turns into an anxiety disorder or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's what's going on metabolically that actually makes that difference. So where do we begin, right? Outside of our breath, of course. First thing is to begin to breathe properly, right? And step two is the 4-pillar fix, right? Those 4 pillars of wellness are so important. Eat, move, rest, and detox. Knowing your dynamic metabolic type helps you to know exactly how to address eat, move, rest, and detox, exactly how to do it so that you're building up metabolism foundationally deep in the levels of the cells, and you're maximizing how much energy your body can then make. You're maximizing your nutrition, you're maximizing your exercise, right? You want to get the benefits of exercise. You don't want the benefits, you don't want the exercises to backfire on you, right? You want to be doing the right things for your dynamic metabolic type so that you're flowing with your body and you're leading your body out of burnout and you're not leaving it behind, right? So that's often a mistake that I see is people are over exercising or even under exercising for where their dynamic metabolic type is. And all that really does is create a bigger rift and more of a metabolic issue. And so I see that a lot, especially with my clients who come in for weight loss. Like, I can't exercise any more than I do, right? And the reason is that there's this mismatch, right? They're way outpacing where their bodies are because their metabolisms are broken, unfortunately. So we have to like kind of teach them how to meet their bodies where the body is and lead the body forward through the 4 pillars, through the knowing of their dynamic metabolic type. So if you haven't taken our burnout assessment, I encourage you to go to awakenwellnessnow.com, take the burnout assessment, and see how your dynamic metabolic type can lead to your 4-pillar fix. We're updating our burnout assessment so that you get a customized report in your inbox, and we're hoping to roll that out within the next week. So I'm not saying that mental health is not real. It's very real, but it's also metabolic. And that's the missing link that we really need to recognize and address if we're going to have a full and complete resolution of mental health disorders. So you don't need to fight your brain. It's your ally. It's just, again, you need to guide it. And your breath is the biggest guide that you can provide to your brain. And then making sure that you've got your 4 pillars up and running to support the brain, because your brain really wants to do the right thing. It's just when it's sensing itself to be unsafe, it has to assure your survival, and it will spare nothing to assure your survival. It's just that that does not feel good to us, right? We don't want to be stuck in survival mode. So this is a great way to train the brain, right? So forget about training the dragons, right? We're training the brain to do what we want it to do, right? So we're taking our power back and making sure that we understand the reasons why we're not feeling well specifically so that we can repair our metabolism, get out of burnout, resolve mental health issues completely, and live our best life. So the emotion of the heart is joy. The emotion of the brain, because it's part of kidney, according to Chinese medicine theory, is fear. And so the choice that you make when you're breathing is between joy and fear. And that's exactly how the brain responds to the breath. It either sends all of the joy signals into the body or it sends all of the fear signals into the body. And the beauty is that we get to choose. And so I hope you found this podcast to be helpful. Please tell me in the comments what you got out of this podcast. I'd love to know what you'd like to learn more about. And if you want to work with us, I encourage you to watch our training at awakenwellnessnow.com and schedule a burnout resolution discovery call where we'll walk you through the solutions to burnout that'll work for you. And remember, we have our corporate resolution solutions as well. So we have our corporate burnout assessment. If you'd like to take that, please connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message. I'm happy to share our burnout assessment with you for your corporation so that you can start to plan to have an amazing, healthy team that supports your corporation to reach its mission and vision. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thank you for listening. And until next time, many, many blessings.